Somewhere in the swamplands of southern Mexico, buried beneath centuries of tropical growth, there are stone heads, massive, brooding, carved from single blocks of basalt weighing as much as 50 tons. Their lips are thick, their eyes stare forward with a calm that borders on menace. Their helmets sit tight against their skulls, as if prepared for some contest whose rules have been lost to time. These heads were not made by the Maya. They were not made by the Aztecs. They were made by a civilization so old, so mysterious, and so thoroughly erased from the historical record that when the first head was discovered in 1862, nobody had any idea who carved it. Nobody had a name for the people who left it behind. Nobody even believed such a civilization could have existed in that part of the world, at that point in time. And yet there it was, a face from the deep past, staring up from the mud, waiting to be recognized. That civilization is now called the Olmec, and what we know about them can be written on a few pages. What we do not know could fill entire libraries. Consider this. The Olmec civilization flourished in the lowlands of what is now Veracruz and Tabasco, in a region of rivers, swamps, and dense jungle, roughly 3,000 years ago according to current archaeological estimates. They built the first major cities in Mesoamerica. They developed what many scholars believe to be the earliest writing system in the Western Hemisphere. They created a calendar that tracked the movements of celestial bodies with astonishing precision. They practiced a complex religion involving jaguars, serpents, and supernatural beings whose images would echo through every civilization that followed them for the next 2,000 years. They traded over vast distances, moving jade, obsidian, and magnetite across hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain. They built pyramids. They shaped enormous thrones from stone transported from volcanic mountains more than 80 kilometers away, across rivers and through wetlands, without the wheel, without draft animals, without metal tools. And then, for reasons no one fully understands, their great centers were abandoned. Their monuments were defaced, their cities were swallowed by the jungle, and the people who came after them, the Maya, the Zapotec, the Aztec, built their own civilizations on foundations the Olmec had laid, often without remembering the name of the ones who came first. The Olmec are called the mother civilization of Mesoamerica. That phrase carries an enormous weight. It means that nearly everything we associate with ancient Mexico and Central America, the pyramids, the ball courts, the calendar systems, the feathered serpent, the practice of ritual bloodletting, the obsession with cosmic cycles, all of it traces back, in some form, to a people who vanished before most of those later cultures even began. A civilization of perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, spread across multiple cities, producing art of extraordinary sophistication, organizing labor on a monumental scale, and engaging with ideas about time, death, and the cosmos that still puzzle researchers today. And yet we do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke with certainty. We do not have a single Olmec text that has been fully deciphered. We have their faces, carved in stone. We have their jade figurines and their clay vessels. We have the ruins of their ceremonial centers, partially excavated, partially destroyed, partially lost beneath the water table. And we have questions, so many questions that multiply with every new discovery. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why the Olmec matter far more than most people realize. You are going to see how a civilization that thrived in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth laid the groundwork for every great culture that followed it in the Americas. You are going to learn how their disappearance represents one of the most significant unsolved mysteries in archaeology. And you are going to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about human civilization itself, which is that the things we build, the knowledge we accumulate, the stories we tell about who we are and where we came from, can be erased so completely that even our names are forgotten. The Olmec built monuments that have survived for 3 millennia, but their identity did not survive. Their stories did not survive. The faces endured. The voices were lost. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The Olmec left behind colossal heads, but no voices. They left behind pyramids, but no written histories we can read. They left behind a legacy that shaped an entire hemisphere, but no memory of who they were as a people with names, with families, with songs and sorrows. Tonight, we go looking for them. We follow the rivers into the jungle. We dig beneath the mud. We trace the outlines of a world that vanished so long ago that even the civilizations that inherited its wisdom did not know its name. And we ask the question that every archaeologist working in Mesoamerica has asked at some point in their career. Who were the Olmec and why did they disappear? Now, let's begin. To understand the Olmec, we must first understand the world they inhabited and the place they hold in the long arc of human civilization in the Americas. And to do that, we need to grasp a sense of scale that most people never consider. Human beings have lived in the Americas for a very long time. Current archaeological evidence, based on sites like Monte Verde in Chile, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, and the White Sands footprints in New Mexico, suggests that people were present in the Western Hemisphere at least 20,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. For most of that vast stretch of time, these people lived as hunters, gatherers, and fishers. They moved with the seasons, they followed herds across grasslands and tundra. They adapted to environments ranging from Arctic ice sheets to tropical rainforest to high-altitude plateaus. They left behind stone tools, fire pits, bones, and occasionally, the ghostly impressions of their footprints in ancient mud. But they did not, as far as we can tell, build cities. They did not carve monuments. They did not develop writing. For thousands upon thousands of years, the human story in the Americas was one of small groups moving through vast, wild landscapes, surviving, adapting, learning the rhythms of the land, and leaving almost no permanent mark on the earth. Then something changed. In certain regions, people began to settle. They began to cultivate plants, particularly maize, squash, and beans, the triad of crops that would sustain Mesoamerican civilizations for millennia to come. They began to live in permanent villages. They began to make pottery. They began to bury their dead with care and ceremony, placing offerings alongside the bodies that spoke of a belief in something beyond the material world. And in the humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast of Mexico, in a landscape of rivers, lagoons, and seasonal floods, one group of people began to do something that no one in the Americas had done before on this scale. They began to build. Not small structures for daily use, but enormous platforms, plazas, and monuments that required the coordinated effort of hundreds or thousands of workers over months and years. The earliest Olmec center that archaeologists have identified is a site called San Lorenzo, located on a plateau above the Coatzacoalcos River in the modern Mexican state of Veracruz. According to current archaeological estimates, San Lorenzo began to emerge as a significant settlement around 1800 before the Common Era, and it reached its peak between 1200 and 900 before the Common Era. To put that in perspective, when San Lorenzo was at its height, the city of Rome did not exist. It would not be founded for another several centuries. The Greek alphabet had not yet been developed. The Iron Age was just beginning in the Near East. The great kingdoms of classical antiquity, Athens, Sparta, Persia, were still far in the future. The pyramids of Egypt were already ancient, but in the Western Hemisphere, nothing of comparable scale had been attempted. And yet, here, in the swamps of southern Mexico, people were constructing a ceremonial center that covered more than 700 hectares, reshaping the natural plateau into a massive artificial platform rising above the floodplain, and carving portraits of their rulers from blocks of basalt that weighed tens of tons. Consider the effort involved, because the logistics alone tell a story of extraordinary social organization. The basalt used for the colossal heads and thrones at San Lorenzo came from the Tuxtla Mountains, a volcanic range located roughly 80 kilometers to the northwest. There were no wheeled vehicles anywhere in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. There were no horses, oxen, or any other draft animals available. The stone had to be quarried from the mountainside using stone tools, shaped into rough form at the quarry site, and then transported across rivers, through swamps, and over difficult terrain using only human muscle, wooden rollers, and rafts floated along rivers and coastal waterways. A single colossal head can weigh between 6 and 50 tons. The largest, known as San Lorenzo Monument 1, stands nearly 3.5 meters tall and weighs an estimated 25 tons. The logistics of moving even one such object across 80 kilometers of tropical wetland, in a climate of extreme heat and humidity, without metal tools or animal power, represents an organizational achievement of the first order. It required planning, it required coordination, it required surplus food to feed the workers, it required authority to direct the labor, and the Olmec did this not once, but many times, producing at least 17 colossal heads across their various centers, along with massive stone thrones, altars, stelae, and other monuments. This is not the work of a simple village society. This is the work of a complex, stratified, well-organized civilization with strong leadership, surplus food production, specialized craftspeople, and the ability to mobilize and coordinate large numbers of workers over extended periods. To move a 25-ton block of basalt 80 kilometers through a swamp, you need more than strength. You need logistics. You need someone who knows the route. You need someone who can organize food and water for the workers along the way. You need someone who can solve the problems that arise when the raft gets stuck, when the river changes course, when the ropes break. You need, in short, a government, or at least something that functions like one. And this is what makes the Olmecs so important in the grand narrative of Mesoamerican civilization. They were the first in Mesoamerica to achieve this level of social complexity, the first to build monumental architecture, the first to create a distinctive art style that would influence the entire region for 2,000 years, the first to develop the cultural patterns, the religious ideas, the artistic conventions, and possibly the writing and calendar systems that would later find their fullest expression in the Maya, the Zapotec, the Mixtec, and the Aztec. The American archaeologist Michael Coe, one of the most important scholars of Mesoamerican civilization in the 20th century, was among the first to articulate this idea clearly and forcefully in his work during the 1960s and 70s, and in his influential textbook, Mexico. From the Olmecs to the Aztecs, Coe argued that the Olmec represented a mother culture, a foundational civilization from which later Mesoamerican cultures derived many of their core traits. This was a provocative claim when first advanced, and it remains debated today. It suggested that the Maya, long celebrated as the intellectual giants of pre-Columbian America, owed a profound debt to an earlier, less well-known people. It implied a hierarchy of influence that some scholars found reductive. Not everyone agreed. Other scholars, including Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus of the University of Michigan, argued for a more complex model, suggesting that many Mesoamerican civilizations developed in parallel, influencing each other through trade and interaction, rather than all descending from a single source. This debate, known as the mother culture versus sister cultures debate, has shaped Olmec studies for decades and continues to generate productive disagreement. But regardless of which model one favors, the basic facts are not in dispute. The Olmec were among the earliest complex societies in Mesoamerica. Their influence was vast, and the cultural traits they pioneered became the shared inheritance of every civilization that followed. Let us consider some of those traits in detail, because the list is long and its implications are profound. The Olmec ball game, a ritual sport played on formal courts with a heavy rubber ball, is one of the most distinctive features of Mesoamerican culture. It was played by the Maya, the Aztec, and dozens of other groups across Mexico and Central America for over 2,000 years. It was more than a sport. It was a ritual, a political event, a cosmic drama in which the movements of the ball represented the movements of heavenly bodies, and the outcome could carry life or death consequences. The earliest known ball court in Mesoamerica has been found at the Olmec site of San Lorenzo, dating to roughly 1400 before the Common Era, making the Olmec the probable originators of a tradition that would endure for millennia. The Olmec fascination with the jaguar, which they depicted in countless sculptures, figurines, and relief carvings, often blending human and feline features into supernatural beings known as wer-jaguars, became a central motif in later Mesoamerican religion. The jaguar was the most powerful predator in the Mesoamerican world. It hunted by night. It moved silently through the forest. It could swim rivers and climb trees. For the Olmec, the jaguar appears to have symbolized power, authority, and access to the supernatural realm. Olmec rulers may have believed they could transform into jaguars during ritual performances, accessing the power of the animal spirit for purposes of divination, warfare, and governance. This concept of the ruler as shapeshifter, as a being who could move between the human and animal worlds, persisted in Mesoamerican religion for 2,000 years. The Olmec practice of creating elaborate jade offerings, carefully buried in symbolic arrangements beneath plazas and platforms, prefigured similar practices among the Maya and other groups. Jade was the most precious material in the Mesoamerican world, valued more highly than gold. It was associated with water, fertility, life, and the supernatural. The Olmec obtained their jade from sources hundreds of kilometers away, in the mountains of Guatemala and the Mexican state of Guerrero, and they worked it with extraordinary skill, producing figurines, masks, beads, and celts of exquisite quality. The value they placed on jade and the ritual practices they developed around it became a permanent feature of Mesoamerican culture. The numbers are striking. Consider the timeline once more, but from a different angle. The Olmec civilization, from the rise of San Lorenzo to the decline of La Venta, the last major Olmec center, spanned roughly 1,000 years, from about 1400 before the Common Era to perhaps 400 before the Common Era. 1,000 years. To feel the weight of that number, consider what 1,000 years means in more familiar terms. 1,000 years ago from today, Europe was in the early medieval period. The Norman conquest of England had not yet happened. The Crusades had not yet been launched. The Magna Carta had not been written. The printing press was centuries in the future. 1,000 years is longer than the Roman Empire lasted from the founding of the Republic to the fall of the Western Empire. It is longer than the entire lifespan of the British Empire, from its earliest colonial ventures to its final dissolution. The Olmecs sustained their civilization for that long. They maintained their traditions, their art style, their religious practices, their political organization, their trade networks for 1,000 years in a tropical swamp. And then, despite lasting a millennium, they left behind so little written material, so few clues about their daily lives, their politics, their personal beliefs, that reconstructing their history is like trying to read a book from which 95% of the pages have been torn out, and the remaining 5% have been soaked in water. Part of the reason for this devastating loss is the environment itself. The Gulf Coast lowlands of Mexico are among the most destructive environments on Earth for archaeological preservation. The climate is hot, with temperatures routinely exceeding 35 degrees Celsius in the summer months. Humidity is extreme, often above 90%. Rainfall is heavy, exceeding 2,000 millimeters per year in many areas and approaching 3,000 in some. The soil is acidic, rich in organic compounds that accelerate the decay of biological materials. The rivers flood regularly, burying sites under layers of alluvial silt that can be meters thick. The jungle reclaims cleared land within a few years, sending roots through walls, splitting stone, and burying structures under a blanket of vegetation that hides them from view. Anything the Olmec made from perishable materials is gone. Their books, if they had books, are gone. Their wooden buildings are gone. Their clothing, their baskets, their feathered ornaments, their woven mats, their bark paper texts, all gone. Consumed by fungi, bacteria, insects, and the relentless chemistry of tropical decay. What remains is stone, jade, ceramic, and the occasional fragment of bone or shell. And from these fragments, archaeologists must reconstruct an entire civilization, its social structure, its economy, its religion, its politics, its art, its daily life, its rise, its fall, and its legacy. The first serious archaeological work at Olmec sites began in the early 20th century, and the story of that work is itself a fascinating tale of discovery, controversy, and gradual revelation. In 1925, the Danish archaeologist Franz Blom and the American Oliver Lafarge visited the site of La Venta in Tabasco during an expedition sponsored by Tulane University. They documented the large earthen mound, the carved stone monuments, and the general layout of the site, though they did not fully appreciate the age or significance of what they had found. In 1938, the American archaeologist Matthew Stirling, working under the auspices of the Smithsonian Institution, led the first systematic excavation at Tres Zapotes, another site in the Olmec region of Veracruz. There, Sterling uncovered a colossal head and, more significantly, a broken stela bearing a long count date, a type of calendrical notation that had previously been associated exclusively with the Maya. Sterling's discovery was revolutionary, and it ignited a controversy that would smolder for decades. The date on the stela, known as Stela C, corresponded to 31 before the Common Era, when the missing fragment was eventually found and the date completed. This made it one of the oldest long-count dates ever found, predating many known Maya inscriptions. The implication was startling and, to many scholars at the time, unacceptable. The long-count calendar, one of the Maya's most celebrated intellectual achievements, might actually have originated not with the Maya but with the Olmec, or their close neighbours in the Gulf Coast and Isthmian regions. The Maya specialist Sylvanus Morley and other defenders of Maya primacy pushed back hard against this idea, arguing that the Olmec were a later development influenced by the Maya rather than the other way around. It took decades of additional fieldwork, additional discoveries, and additional radiocarbon dates to settle the matter. The Olmec were indeed earlier. The evidence was clear. Sterling went on to excavate at San Lorenzo and La Venta through the 1940s and 50s, uncovering more colossal heads, massive stone thrones, intricate jade figurines, and elaborate buried offerings. His work, and the work of his wife Marion Sterling, who contributed significantly to the documentation and interpretation of the finds, established the Olmec as a major civilization and opened the door for the decades of research that followed. But Sterling also encountered something troubling at San Lorenzo, something that has puzzled archaeologists ever since. Many of the monuments had been deliberately mutilated. Colossal heads had been dragged from their original positions and buried in rows. Thrones had been defaced, their carved surfaces hammered and gouged with systematic thoroughness. Some monuments had been placed in what appeared to be ritual arrangements, set carefully positioned in specific orientations before being covered with earth. This was not random damage. This was intentional, systematic destruction, carried out with purpose and, it seems, with ceremony. What happened at San Lorenzo? Why were the monuments destroyed? Was it an internal revolution, a conquered people overthrowing their rulers and destroying the symbols of their power? Was it a foreign invasion, an outside force desecrating the sacred sites of a defeated enemy? Or was it something else entirely? A ritual act carried out by the Olmec themselves, a deliberate closing of a ceremonial chapter, a sacred decommissioning of a place that had served its cosmic purpose? We do not know. The evidence supports all three interpretations, and possibly others that have not yet been imagined. And this ambiguity is characteristic of Olmec archaeology as a whole. The evidence is suggestive, but never conclusive. The patterns are visible, but never fully explained. The Olmec reveal just enough to make us desperate for more, and then they fall silent, as if they know the power of an unanswered question. Before we proceed further, we need to talk about rubber. The Olmec word, or at least the word associated with them centuries later, refers to rubber, and rubber is not a trivial substance in the story of Mesoamerican civilization. The Olmec had access to the Castilla elastica tree, which produces natural latex, and they appear to have been among the first peoples in the Americas to process this latex into usable rubber by mixing it with juice from the morning glory vine, a chemical process that vulcanizes the raw latex and transforms it from a sticky, perishable sap into a durable, elastic material. From this rubber, they made balls. Solid, heavy, bouncing rubber balls, some of which have been found preserved in the waterlogged soils of the Olmec heartland, their surfaces still faintly elastic after 3,000 years. These balls were used in the Mesoamerican ballgame, a ritual sport played on specially constructed courts that became one of the most defining cultural practices of the entire region, played from Honduras to Arizona for over 2 millennia after the Olmec first formalized it. The ballgame was not mere recreation. In later Mesoamerican cultures, it carried profound cosmological significance, reenacting the movements of celestial bodies, dramatizing the struggle between life and death, and sometimes culminating in the sacrifice of one or more of the players. Ball courts have been found at Olmec sites, and the colossal heads themselves may depict rulers wearing ball game helmets. linking the sport to the highest levels of political and religious authority. When you watch a modern-day rubber ball bounce, in some distant, attenuated sense, you are watching a technology the Olmec perfected. The Olmec trade networks extended far beyond the rubber groves and cacao orchards of the Gulf Coast lowlands. Obsidian, the volcanic glass prized throughout Mesoamerica for its razor-sharp cutting edges, reached the Olmec heartland from sources in the highlands of Guatemala and central Mexico, over 500 kilometers away. Jade, the most symbolically charged material in the Olmec world, associated with water, fertility, life, and the breath of the divine, was imported from sources in the Motagua River Valley of Guatemala, a journey of comparable distance through some of the most difficult terrain in Central America. Magnetite and ilmenite for the polished mirrors came from Oaxaca and Chiapas. Mica, serpentine, and various other materials arrived from different directions. The Olmec did not merely receive these goods passively. They appear to have actively maintained and managed trade relationships that spanned the breadth of Mesoamerica, acting as a hub in a network that linked the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, the highlands to the lowlands, and the tropical forests to the arid valleys. In return, the Olmec exported not just material goods, but ideas, artistic styles, religious iconography, and possibly institutional models that spread across the region, a pattern that archaeologists have called, with some debate, the Olmec Horizon, a period of widespread Olmec cultural influence that preceded the more familiar horizons associated with Teotihuacan and the Aztec. The Olmec use of cacao, the raw material from which chocolate is derived, deserves mention here because it connects them to one of the most enduring economic and cultural traditions in Mesoamerican history. Chemical analysis of residues found in Olmec pottery vessels has revealed traces of theobromine, the signature compound of cacao, in vessels dating to roughly 1700 before the Common Era, making the Olmec among the earliest known users of chocolate. In later Mesoamerican civilizations, cacao beans served as a form of currency, and chocolate drinks were consumed by elites in elaborate ritual contexts. The Olmec, it appears, were at the origin of this tradition as well, adding another thread to the vast web of cultural inheritance that connects them to the civilizations that followed. The Olmec relationship with their landscape was not passive. They did not simply inhabit the Gulf Coast lowlands. They reshaped them. At San Lorenzo, the entire plateau was modified, sculpted into a shape that may have been intentional, perhaps representing a giant bird or some other symbolic form when viewed from above. Drainage systems were carved into the bedrock, elaborate stone-lined channels that directed water through the site, in patterns that may have served both practical and ceremonial purposes. Some of these channels were carved in the shape of ducks or other waterfowl, combining engineering function with artistic expression in a way that speaks to the Olmec tendency to see the sacred in the practical and the practical in the sacred. The labor required to reshape an entire plateau, to carve drainage channels through bedrock, to transport and erect massive stone monuments, all of this required a level of social organization that implies a state or proto-state, a political entity with the authority to command labor, allocate resources, and enforce the collective will of the ruling class. The question of Olmec political organization is one of the most debated topics in Mesoamerican archaeology. Were the Olmec organized into a single unified state, with one paramount ruler who controlled the entire heartland from a single capital? Or were they organized into multiple competing chiefdoms, each centered on its own ceremonial center, linked by trade and shared culture but politically independent? The evidence is ambiguous. The fact that San Lorenzo and La Venta appear to have been dominant at different times, with on San Lorenzo peaking between 1200 and 900 before the Common Era, and La Venta peaking between 900 and 400 before the Common Era, has led some scholars to argue for a sequential model in which political power shifted from one center to another over the centuries. Others have argued that multiple centers may have coexisted, competing for prestige and control of trade routes in a dynamic political landscape that shifted and realigned over time. The truth is that we cannot yet distinguish between these models with confidence, because the evidence, once again, is incomplete. After San Lorenzo declined around 900 before the Common Era, the center of Olmec civilization shifted to La Venta, located about 80 kilometers to the northeast, on an island surrounded by swamps near the Tonelá River in Tabasco. La Venta was, if anything, even more impressive than San Lorenzo in the ambition and sophistication of its ritual landscape. Its centerpiece was a massive earthen mound, roughly 30 meters tall, shaped into a fluted cone that some archaeologists have interpreted as a representation of a volcanic mountain, perhaps the very mountains from which the sacred basalt was quarried. The site included elaborate mosaic pavements made of hundreds of serpentine blocks, painstakingly shaped and fitted together in abstract patterns, and then buried deep beneath the surface where no living eye would see them. There were tombs containing jade figurines and ornaments of extraordinary craftsmanship. There were polished mirrors made of magnetite and ilmenite, ground to a concave surface that could focus light and produce reflections of remarkable clarity. And there were offerings of such richness and care that the labor invested in creating them, and then burying them forever, speaks to a depth of religious conviction that transcends our easy understanding. And then La Venta, too, was abandoned. Around 400 before the Common Era, the site was deserted, its monuments once again deliberately defaced and buried. The Olmec heartland fell quiet. The great centers were reclaimed by the jungle, and the people who had built them, who had carved those brooding faces, and buried those jade offerings, and moved those impossible stones, seemed to vanish from the story of the world. But what scientists discovered next was worse than anyone expected. The core problem with the Olmec is not that we know too little about them, though we certainly do. It is that what we do know raises questions we cannot answer, and those questions, when examined closely, challenge some of our most basic ideas about how civilizations work, how they transmit knowledge, how they preserve identity across generations, and how completely they can be forgotten even when their achievements endure. Start with the colossal heads, because these are the artifacts that most people associate with the Olmec, and because they embody, in basalt and silence, the central paradox of this lost civilization. 17 colossal heads have been found so far, 10 at San Lorenzo, 4 at La Venta, 2 at Tres Zapotes, and 1 at the smaller site of La Cobata. They range in height from about 1.5 meters to over 3 meters. They weigh between 6 and 50 tons. Each one depicts a distinct human face, with individualized features, different nose shapes, different lip structures, different cheek contours, that strongly suggest these are portraits of specific people, almost certainly rulers, or other figures of supreme importance in Olmec society. They wear close-fitting helmets, sometimes decorated with symbols or designs that may represent clan affiliations, achievements, or supernatural attributes. Their expressions are calm, authoritative, composed, devoid of the theatrical emotion that characterizes much later Mesoamerican art. There is a weight to them, a psychological gravity, that transcends their physical mass. Standing before one of these heads in a museum, you feel the presence of a real person, someone who lived and ruled and made decisions that shaped the lives of thousands, someone whose name you will never know. But here's the problem. We do not know the names of the people they depict. We do not know the order in which they were carved. We do not know the ceremonies that surrounded their creation or their public display. We do not know whether they were meant to be seen by the general population or reserved for elite audiences within restricted ceremonial precincts. We do not even know for certain what their helmets represent, though theories range from ballgame headgear to military helmets to symbols of royal authority to markers of specific supernatural identities. Each head is a portrait of a ruler whose name, whose deeds, whose dynasty, whose loves, whose wars, whose entire world has been erased from human memory as completely as if it had never existed. They are faces without stories, portraits without captions, monuments to people who have been forgotten so thoroughly that they have become monuments to forgetting itself, and the mystery deepens when we consider how they were made. The basalt from which the San Lorenzo heads were carved came from the Serasenti Pec area of the Tuxtla Mountains. The process of quarrying, rough shaping, transporting, and finish carving a single head would have required enormous effort, coordination, and skill spread over months or possibly years. The Olmec had no metal chisels, no iron tools, no bronze implements of any kind. They worked the basalt using stone tools, hammers of a harder stone like jadeite or quartzite, and abrasives such as sand. The precision of the carving, the smooth curves of the cheeks and chin, the naturalistic rendering of the nose and lips, the subtle asymmetries that give each face its individual character and sense of life, is extraordinary given the tools available. These are not crude efforts by beginners feeling their way toward artistic expression. These are masterworks, products of a mature artistic tradition, executed by skilled craftspeople who had spent years learning their art. And this is where something strange enters the picture. The Olmec art style appears, in the archaeological record, almost fully formed. There is no clear, well-documented sequence of development from simple to complex, no fumbling early attempts, followed by gradual refinement over generations. The earliest Olmec art that has been found is already sophisticated, already distinctive, already powerful. The naturalism of the colossal heads, the surreal intensity of the Wajaguar imagery, the fine detail of the jade figurines, all of it seems to arrive without a clear developmental preamble. This has led some scholars to speculate that earlier phases of development existed, but have been destroyed by the hostile environment of the Gulf Coast, swallowed by floods, dissolved by acidic soil, consumed by the jungle. Others have suggested that the Olmec drew on artistic traditions from neighboring regions that we have not yet identified, importing aesthetic ideas along with the jade and obsidian they traded for. But the honest answer is that we do not know where the Olmec art style came from. It seems to emerge from the swamps, fully grown, like a figure rising from dark water. Then there is the question of writing, a question that goes to the very heart of what it means for a civilization to be remembered or forgotten. For decades, scholars debated whether the Olmec had a writing system at all. The evidence was thin and ambiguous. A few symbols carved on monuments, a few glyphs that seemed to repeat in ways that might suggest a system of notation. Nothing that could be definitively identified as writing rather than symbolic art. Then, in the year 2006, a team of researchers including Maria del Carmen Rodriguez Martinez published a report on the discovery of a stone block at the site of Cascajal, near San Lorenzo, bearing a text of 62 symbols arranged in what appeared to be horizontal rows. The Cascajal block, as it became known, was dated through its archaeological context to roughly 900 before the Common Era, which would make it the oldest known writing in the Western Hemisphere if the identification as writing is correct. The symbols on the Cascajal block included images that appear to represent insects, corn, fish, plants, and various abstract signs. Some symbols appeared to repeat, which is a crucial indicator of a true writing system, since writing works by combining a finite set of reusable symbols to create an infinite range of meanings. The discovery was published in the journal Science and received widespread attention. But it also generated controversy. Some scholars questioned whether the symbols truly constituted writing, rather than a series of iconographic elements arranged decoratively. Others questioned the dating of the block. The debate continues, and the Cascajal block remains undeciphered. No one has been able to read it. It sits in its display case, a message from a vanished world, visible but incomprehensible, like a letter written in an ink that has faded to the point where the words can be seen but not read. And it gets worse. If the Cascajal block represents genuine Olmec writing, then the Olmec had a literary tradition, a body of recorded thought, that has been almost entirely lost. Think carefully about what that means. The Olmec may have written histories, genealogies, astronomical tables, religious texts, ritual instructions, records of trade and diplomacy, accounts of wars and alliances, myths of creation and destruction. They may have recorded the names of their kings and queens, the dates of their coronations and their deaths, the prophecies of their priests, the songs of their poets. They may have had libraries, or at least collections of texts stored in temples and palaces and schools. All of it is gone, every word, every sentence, every story. The humid environment of the Gulf Coast destroyed whatever perishable materials they wrote on. Bark paper rots, wood decays, painted cloth dissolves. Even stone inscriptions, exposed to centuries of rain and root action and microbial growth, can become illegible. We are looking at a civilization through a keyhole, catching glimpses of a vast room whose contents we can barely make out, and the few things we can see only make the darkness beyond more tantalizing. The religion of the Olmec presents its own labyrinth of puzzles. Their art is saturated with supernatural imagery, beings that combine human and animal features in ways that suggest an elaborate mythology, a complex system of beliefs about the nature of reality and the structure of the cosmos. The most famous of these supernatural beings is the so-called were-jaguar, a figure with a human body and a feline face, often depicted with a snarling mouth, showing prominent canine teeth, down-turned lips that give the face a perpetual expression of distress or rage, and distinctive flame-shaped eyebrows that may represent a supernatural attribute. Were-jaguars appear on altars, figurines, celts, relief carvings, and pottery across the Olmec world and beyond. Some scholars, following the early work of Michael Coe, have interpreted the were-jaguar as a rain deity, an ancestral form of the later Mesoamerican rain gods Tlaloc and Chak, whose powers over water and fertility were essential to agricultural societies. Others have seen it as a symbol of royal power, a supernatural alter ego that rulers assumed during trance states induced by bloodletting, fasting, or the ingestion of psychoactive substances. Still others, following a hypothesis proposed by Peter David Joralemon in the 1970s, have suggested that the were-jaguar represents the offspring of a mythological union between a human woman and a jaguar spirit, a founding myth for the Olmec ruling lineage that legitimized their authority by linking them to the supernatural world, but without written texts to guide us, without the Olmec equivalent of the Popol Vuh or the Egyptian Book of the Dead. These interpretations remain educated guesses, informed speculations that may capture something of the truth, but can never be confirmed. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the Olmec religious world was populated by a host of supernatural beings, and that the boundaries between the human and the divine were understood to be permeable. Olmec art depicts figures in various stages of transformation, humans becoming jaguars, jaguars becoming humans, beings that are simultaneously both and neither. This theme of transformation, of the crossing of boundaries between natural categories, is one of the most distinctive and persistent features of Mesoamerican religion, appearing in different forms across 2,000 years and dozens of distinct cultures. The shamanic trance, the ritual journey to the spirit world, the deliberate crossing of the boundary between ordinary consciousness and the realm of the supernatural was almost certainly central to Olmec religious practice. Small ceramic figurines from Olmec sites sometimes depict seated figures in rigid, stylized postures that suggest trance states, their eyes closed or rolled back, their mouths slightly open, their hands resting on their knees in positions that recall the meditative postures found in religious traditions around the world. Ritual bloodletting, the deliberate piercing of one's own flesh to produce an offering of blood, was another practice that the Olmec appear to have originated or at least formalized. Stingray spines, used as lancets for blood sacrifice in later Mesoamerican cultures, have been found at Olmec sites, and some Olmec relief carvings appear to depict scenes of auto-sacrifice. In later Maya art, bloodletting is depicted in vivid, explicit detail, with rulers piercing their tongues, earlobes, or genitals using obsidian blades or stingray spines, collecting the blood on bark paper, and then burning the paper so that the smoke could carry the offering to the gods. The blood itself was understood not as a mere fluid, but as a substance of tremendous sacred power, the life force that sustained both humans and gods, the medium of exchange between the mortal world and the supernatural realm. If the Maya practiced it with such intensity and such theological sophistication, and if the practice can be traced back to the Olmec heartland 1,000 years before the Maya Classic period, then the Olmec contribution to Mesoamerican religious thought was not merely foundational but constitutive. They did not merely influence later religions. They created the vocabulary, the grammar, the fundamental categories out of which those later religions were constructed. There is a further dimension to the Olmec religious landscape that deserves attention. The Olmec heartland contained three major ceremonial centers: San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Laguna de los Cerros, along with numerous smaller sites scattered across the river valleys and coastal lowlands. Each of these centers appears to have been the seat of a powerful ruler or ruling family, a place where political authority, religious power, and economic control converged in the person of a leader who was both king and priest, both governor and shaman. The layout of these sites, with their carefully oriented plazas, their monumental sculptures positioned along sight lines that may have had astronomical significance, and their elaborate buried offerings placed at locations that seem to mark sacred boundaries, suggests that the Olmec understood their ceremonial centers not as mere collections of buildings, but as sacred landscapes, microcosms of the universe in which the boundaries between the human world and the supernatural world were thin, permeable, and accessible to those who knew the proper rituals. At La Venta, this conception of the ceremonial center as a cosmic model reached its most elaborate expression. The site was laid out along a north-south axis, with the Great Mound at the southern end, and a series of plazas, platforms, and offering deposits extending northward in a carefully planned sequence. Massive offerings of serpentine blocks were buried in cruciform patterns deep beneath the surface, visible to no human eye, covered by layers of clay and sand immediately after their placement. These offerings were not meant to be seen, they were meant to be there. Their purpose was not display, but sanctification, the charging of the earth itself with sacred power through the burial of precious materials in symbolic arrangements. The labor involved in creating these offerings was immense. Hundreds of blocks of serpentine, a greenish stone associated with water and the earth, were carefully shaped and fitted together in mosaic patterns that may represent stylized jaguar faces or abstract cosmological diagrams, and then covered over and sealed. The builders knew that no living person would ever see their work again. They buried it anyway. Whatever they were doing, it was not for human audiences. It was for something else. One of the most haunting discoveries at La Venta was a group of 16 small figurines and 6 jade celts found in 1955 by archaeologists working under the direction of Philip Drucker and Robert Heiser. The figurines, made of jade, serpentine, and granite, are slender, stylized human forms, roughly 15 to 20 centimeters tall, with elongated heads, narrow bodies, and simplified features. They were arranged in a semicircle, as if attending a meeting or ceremony, facing a single figure who stood with its back against a row of 6 jade celts set upright in the earth, like standing stones or stelae. The arrangement is clearly deliberate, clearly meaningful, a snapshot of a moment frozen in jade and stone. But what moment? Who are these figures? What ceremony are they performing? Why was this scene buried in a pit beneath the plaza of La Venta and covered with layers of coloured clay? And why, when archaeologists found it, did they discover that someone, at some point after the original burial, had dug a hole down through the overlying layers to peek at the offering, and then had carefully filled the hole back in? Someone remembered. Someone, perhaps generations after the offering was made, knew it was there and checked on it and then sealed it up again. Who? Why? The scene raises more questions than a shelf of books could answer. The Olmec also created some of the earliest mirrors in Mesoamerica, polished from iron ore minerals, specifically magnetite, ilmenite, and hematite, to a concave surface that produced a remarkably clear reflection. These mirrors were small, usually no more than 10 centimeters in diameter, and they were often perforated so they could be worn as pendants, perhaps on the chest of a priest or ruler. They were not vanity objects. Ethnographic analogies with later Mesoamerican peoples suggest that polished mirrors were used for divination, for peering into the spirit world, for starting sacred fires by focusing sunlight, and for projecting spots of light during ceremonial performances. The skill required to polish these hard iron ore minerals to a concave mirror finish using only stone tools and abrasives is extraordinary. Modern experiments have shown that producing a single Olmec-style mirror could take hundreds of hours of patient grinding and polishing. The Olmec command of this technology speaks to a level of craft specialization, a tradition of skilled labor passed from master to apprentice over generations that we tend to associate with much later, much more familiar civilizations. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The Olmec achieved all of this: the monumental architecture, the sophisticated art, the complex religion, the possible writing system, the long-distance trade networks, the specialized crafts, the elaborate ritual life, in an environment that actively, relentlessly, ceaselessly worked against human settlement and the preservation of human achievement. The Gulf Coast lowlands are flat, they are hot, they are wet, the rivers flood, the insects swarm, the humidity rots everything organic within years. Malaria and other tropical diseases were almost certainly present and must have taken a constant toll on a population. Building in this environment required not just effort, but defiance. Maintaining structures required not just vigilance, but stubbornness. Simply feeding a large population in a swamp required a detailed, intimate, hard-won understanding of the land, the seasons, the rivers, and the crops. The Olmec did not build their civilization in a gentle valley with moderate weather and cooperative soils. They built it in one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth, and they sustained it for 1,000 years, generation after generation after generation, each one maintaining what their parents had built, each one adding their own stone to the edifice. Consider what 1,000 years of continuous cultural tradition actually means in human terms. If we assume an average generation span of roughly 25 years, 1,000 years represents 40 generations. 40 generations of parents teaching children, of masters training apprentices, of priests instructing acolytes, of rulers passing power to their heirs. 40 generations of accumulated knowledge about how to farm the floodplain, how to navigate the rivers, how to quarry and transport stone, how to carve basalt with stone tools, how to polish magnetite into mirrors, how to work jade into figurines and masks and celts. Each generation received this knowledge from the one before it and passed it to the one after, adding their own refinements and innovations, losing some things and gaining others, but maintaining the essential core of the tradition across centuries. And then at some point, the chain broke, the transmission faltered, the accumulated knowledge of 40 generations began to disperse, to fragment, to dissolve into the broader current of Mesoamerican culture, losing its specifically Olmec character with each passing century until the source was forgotten entirely. We can see hints of this process in the archaeological record of the centuries following the decline of La Venta. The Epi-Olmec culture, which succeeded the Olmec in parts of the Gulf Coast, continued many Olmec traditions but in modified forms. The Epi-Olmec developed a more sophisticated writing system, examples of which have been found on monuments like the Tuxtla statuette and the La Mojara stela, the latter bearing a long hieroglyphic text that has been partially deciphered by the epigraphers John Justison and Terence Kaufman. If their decipherment is correct, the language of the Epi-Olmec inscriptions was a form of Mixi-Zoquian, a language family that is still spoken in parts of southern Mexico today. This suggests, though it does not prove, that the Olmec themselves may have spoken a Mixi-Zoquian language, which would make their modern linguistic descendants the Mixi and Zoc peoples of Oaxaca and Chiapas. But this identification remains tentative, and the question of the Olmec language, like so many questions about the Olmec, remains open. Then they stopped, and this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling. The Olmec mystery does not exist in isolation. It is part of a larger pattern that runs through human history, like a fault line beneath the surface, a pattern of civilizations rising to extraordinary heights and then falling into silence, their achievements absorbed, their identities erased, their very existence questioned by later generations. To understand what happened to the Olmec and to grasp the full significance of their disappearance, we must look at other lost civilizations, other vanished peoples, other great experiments in human organization that ended not with a single catastrophic event, but with a long, slow fade into the undergrowth of time. Consider the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India from roughly 2600 to 1900 before the Common Era. At its peak, the Indus Valley Civilization was one of the largest and most sophisticated urban cultures in the ancient world. Its major cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, each housed tens of thousands of inhabitants in carefully planned neighborhoods laid out on grid patterns. The cities had advanced drainage systems, with covered sewers running beneath the streets, that were not matched in Europe until the Roman period more than 1,000 years later. They used standardized weights and measures across vast distances, suggesting a degree of economic coordination that implies central planning or at least widely shared commercial conventions. They produced exquisite art, including the famous bronze figurine known as Dan's Girl, and thousands of carved soapstone seals bearing images of animals, and a script that, like the Olmec writing, remains undeciphered. The Harappans traded with Mesopotamia, sending ships across the Arabian Sea, loaded with carnelian beads, timber, and ivory. They were a great civilization by any standard. And then, around 1900 before the Common Era, the great cities were abandoned. The population dispersed into smaller settlements. The writing system fell out of use. The sophisticated urban infrastructure was neglected and left to crumble. The civilization that had sustained itself for 700 years simply dissolved, leaving behind brick walls and broken seals and a script that no one can read. The reasons for the Harappan collapse are debated. Climate change, specifically the weakening of the monsoon that fed the rivers on which the cities depended, is one leading theory. Tectonic activity that may have diverted course of the Gagahakra River, a major waterway in the Harappan world, is another. Internal social upheaval, epidemic disease, the disruption of trade networks, all have been proposed. The truth is probably a combination of factors. A perfect storm of environmental and social pressures that undermined the foundations of urban life and pushed the population toward dispersal rather than concentration. The parallels with the Olmec are striking, almost uncanny. Both civilizations emerged in challenging environments. The Olmec in tropical swamps, the Harappans in a semi-arid floodplain, dependent on unpredictable monsoon rains and river systems prone to shifting their courses. Both achieved levels of social complexity and material sophistication that seemed disproportionate to the environmental challenges they faced. Both developed writing systems that remain undeciphered, meaning that their own accounts of their history, their beliefs, their political structures, and their decline are inaccessible to us. Both were eventually forgotten by the cultures that succeeded them, only to be rediscovered by modern archaeology. Both present the same fundamental, uncomfortable question. How can a civilization of hundreds of thousands of people, a civilization with cities and trade networks and monumental achievements, simply cease to exist as a recognizable entity? And consider what the undeciphered scripts mean in practical terms. For the Harappan civilization, we have over 4,000 inscribed objects, mostly small soapstone seals bearing short texts of 5 to 26 symbols. Despite more than a century of attempts, including sophisticated computer analyses, no one has been able to crack the Indus script. We do not know what language it encodes. We do not know whether it represents a full writing system or a more limited form of notation. We are locked out of the Harappan mind as surely as if a door had been bolted from the inside. For the Olmec, the situation is even worse. We have only the Cascajal block and a handful of other possible inscriptions. We do not have enough text to attempt a statistical analysis. We do not have a bilingual inscription, a Rosetta Stone, that might allow us to match Olmec symbols to a known language. We are not merely locked out. We do not even know where the door is. There is something deeply humbling about standing before an undeciphered text. It is a message from the past, deliberately composed, carefully carved or written, intended to communicate something that mattered to its creators. And we cannot read it. We can see the symbols. We can photograph them, catalogue them, measure them, analyze their frequency and distribution. But we cannot understand them. The meaning is there, embedded in the arrangement of signs, but it is inaccessible to us, as lost as if the text had been destroyed. An undeciphered script is a form of destruction that looks like preservation. The physical object survives. The information it carries does not. Now, consider the ancestral Puebloans, the people who built the great cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, the vast apartment complexes of Chaco Canyon, and hundreds of other sites across the American Southwest. The ancestral Puebloans, formerly and incorrectly known as the Anasazi, a Navajo word meaning ancient enemies that many modern Pueblo peoples find objectionable, flourished from roughly the 1st century of the Common Era to the late 13th century. Over this span of more than 1,000 years, they developed increasingly complex communities in the arid landscapes of what is now Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. Chaco Canyon, their greatest center, was a place of extraordinary ambition and mystery. Located in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, Chaco contained massive, multi-story structures called Great Houses, the largest of which, Pueblo Bonito, had over 600 rooms and rose 4 or 5 stories high, making it the largest building in North America until a steel-framed apartment building was constructed in New York City in the 1880s. The Chacoans built an extensive network of roads, some of them perfectly straight and up to 9 meters wide, connecting Chaco to outlying communities dozens of kilometers away. They engineered sophisticated water management features, channeling the scarce desert rainfall into collection basins and irrigation channels. They maintained trade connections that brought turquoise from the Cerrillos mines near present-day Santa Fe, cacao from distant Mesoamerica, and macaw feathers from the tropical forests of Mexico over 1,000 kilometers to the south. The roads of Chaco Canyon are particularly mysterious because many of them appear to serve no obvious, practical transportation purpose. They are far wider than necessary for foot traffic. Some run in perfectly straight lines for kilometers, ignoring the terrain, climbing over mesas and descending into ravines rather than following the easier path around them. Some appear to lead to nowhere, ending abruptly in the desert without connecting to any known settlement. Their purpose has been debated for decades. Were they ceremonial processional routes? Were they symbolic representations of cosmological concepts, straight lines connecting sacred places in a geometry that had spiritual significance? Were they designed to impress, to display the power of the Chacoan elite by demonstrating their ability to command the labor necessary to build roads that defied the landscape? Or were they practical features of a system we no longer understand, serving functions that made perfect sense within a cultural context that we can no longer reconstruct? The Chaco roads, like the Olmec serpentine mosaics buried beneath La Venta, represent an enormous investment of labor in projects whose purpose we cannot confidently explain, a reminder that the motivations of past peoples were not always reducible to the categories of economy, defense, and practical convenience that we tend to apply to ancient behavior. And then, in the late 1200s, the great centers were abandoned. Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in North America, a complex of over 150 rooms and 23 kivas built into a natural alcove in a sandstone cliff, was left empty around 1280. Chaco Canyon had been largely abandoned a century earlier, around 1150. The people did not die. They migrated south and east, eventually becoming the Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi and Zuni of Arizona and New Mexico, peoples who are very much alive today and who maintain rich oral traditions about their ancestral migrations. But the great centers, the architectural masterpieces, the ceremonial landscapes they had created, were left to the wind and the sand and the slow erosion of the seasons. The pattern repeats across continents and centuries, as if scripted by some invisible playwright who favors the same tragic arc. The Khmer Empire, centered at Angkor in what is now Cambodia, represents one of the most spectacular cases of urban abandonment in world history. At its peak, in the 12th and 13th centuries of the Common Era, Angkor was the largest pre-industrial city in the world, a sprawling metropolis covering an area of roughly 1,000 square kilometers, an area larger than modern-day New York City. Population estimates vary widely, but some scholars have suggested figures of 700,000 or even approaching 1 million. The Khmer built temples of breathtaking beauty and ambition, including Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever constructed anywhere on Earth, a mountain of stone rising from the jungle floor, its walls covered with relief carvings depicting scenes from Hindu mythology, its towers shaped like lotus buds reaching toward the sky. They developed a complex hydraulic system, a network of enormous reservoirs called barrays, and an intricate web of canals and channels that stored monsoon rainfall and distributed it across the agricultural landscape, enabling the rice production that fed the city and powered the empire. And then Angkor was abandoned. By the 15th century, the great city was largely empty, its temples and reservoirs slowly being consumed by the jungle. The immediate cause appears to have been a combination of Thai invasions, which sacked Angkor in 1431 and shifted the political centre of the Khmer kingdom southward to Phnom Penh, and the gradual breakdown of the hydraulic system, which may have been undermined by decades of drought interspersed with severe floods, a pattern consistent with shifts in the monsoon related to broader climate changes in the region. Some scholars have also pointed to the spread of Theravada Buddhism, which emphasized personal salvation and monastic simplicity over the grandiose temple building that had expressed the Hindu-Buddhist royal ideology of the Angkorian kings, as a factor that eroded the religious justification for the massive labor mobilization that the temple-building program required. When the French naturalist Henri Mouhot visited Angkor in 1860 and brought it to the attention of the Western world through his published journals, the temples were wrapped in the roots of strangler figs, the reservoirs were dry or overgrown with vegetation, and the vast city that had once rivaled any metropolis on earth was a ruin in the forest. Mouhot himself, in a passage that resonates with the Olmec story, wrote of his astonishment at finding works of such magnificence in such a state of abandonment, and he struggled to reconcile the grandeur of the ruins with the apparent simplicity of the surrounding population. The local Cambodians knew the temples existed. They still used some of them for worship. But the full scope of what Angkor had been, the extent of the city, the complexity of its water management, the size of its population, the reach of its trade and political influence, had faded from living memory into legend and fragment. The hydraulic infrastructure of Angkor deserves particular attention because it illustrates a principle that applies directly to the Olmec and, more uncomfortably, to our own civilization. The Khmer did not merely build beautiful temples, they built a system, an integrated, interdependent, finely calibrated system of water management that turned a seasonal landscape into a year-round agricultural powerhouse. The West Barai alone, the largest of the reservoirs, measured 8 kilometers by 2.5 kilometers and held an estimated 53 million cubic meters of water. The canal network that distributed this water across the rice paddies was so extensive and so precisely engineered that some researchers have compared it to the cardiovascular system of a living organism, with the Barais as the heart, the major canals as the arteries, and the smaller channels as the capillaries. This system was the source of Angkor's wealth, power, and population. It was also its greatest vulnerability, because a system of this complexity requires constant maintenance. Canals silt up, dams erode, channels become clogged with vegetation, reservoirs leak. The infrastructure that sustains a complex society is not a one-time investment that, once completed, runs forever on its own. It is a permanent obligation, a permanent cost, a permanent demand on labor, expertise, attention, and political will. When the political structure that organized and directed the maintenance of the hydraulic system weakened, whether through Thai invasions, internal factional strife, religious transformation, or some combination of all of these, the system itself began to degrade. And once a hydraulic system of this complexity begins to degrade, the decline can become self-reinforcing. Failed canals lead to failed harvests. Failed harvests lead to population decline. Population decline leads to labor shortages. Labor shortages lead to further infrastructure decay. The system unravels from within, and by the time the process becomes visible to outside observers, it may already be irreversible. The Olmec faced a version of this same dilemma. Their monumental construction projects, their drainage systems, their shaped plateaus, their transported stone, all required sustained organizational effort, generation after generation. The moment the social structures that coordinated this effort faltered, the Gulf Coast environment, with its floods, its humidity, its relentless biological reclamation of human-altered spaces, began to erase their works. And our own civilization, the most infrastructure-dependent in human history, faces the same fundamental vulnerability, writ incomparably larger. Our electrical grids, our water treatment plants, our transportation networks, our communication systems, our supply chains that deliver food from farm to table across thousands of kilometers. All of these are systems that require constant, expensive, skilled maintenance. They do not run themselves. They have never run themselves. And if the social, economic, and political structures that maintain them were to falter, the consequences would unfold with the same relentless logic that brought Angkor and the Olmec heartland to silence. Now let us turn to one of the most puzzling and consequential episodes in Mediterranean history, an episode that demonstrates how even a well-documented, interconnected world system can collapse with breathtaking speed. In the late Bronze Age, around 1200 before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean was home to a network of powerful, interconnected civilizations. The Egyptian New Kingdom, the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, the Kassite dynasty of Babylon, the trading cities of Ugarit, Byblos, and Sidon on the Levantine coast, all were linked by trade routes that moved copper, tin, gold, ivory, glass, dyed textiles, and ideas across thousands of kilometers of sea and land. It was a golden age of international commerce, a system of mutual dependence and cultural exchange so interconnected that some historians have called it the first globalized economy. And then, within the span of roughly 50 years, between approximately 1200 and 1150 before the Common Era, the entire system collapsed. The Hittite Empire was destroyed, its capital Hattusa burned and abandoned. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece, the centers of a sophisticated Bronze Age culture that had produced the earliest Greek writing and whose legends would later inspire Homer, were burned and abandoned. The trading cities of the Levantine coast were sacked and destroyed. Ugarit, a prosperous cosmopolitan city that had maintained diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and the Hittites, was burned to the ground and never reoccupied. Egypt survived, but barely, fighting off waves of invaders and emerging from the crisis with its power greatly diminished. The Bronze Age world system, a network of civilizations that had flourished for centuries, collapsed into a dark age that lasted for hundreds of years. The cause, or at least the proximate cause, appears to have been a series of invasions by groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, migrant groups or confederacies of raiders who came from the north and west and swept through the eastern Mediterranean, destroying or displacing everything in their path. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III recorded his battles against the Sea Peoples in inscriptions at the Temple of Medinet Habu, naming several god groups including the Peliset, the Jekka, the Shetkelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. But who were the Sea Peoples? Where exactly did they come from? Why did they attack when they did? Were they the cause of the collapse or merely a symptom of deeper structural problems? Drought, famine, trade disruption, internal political instability, epidemic disease that were already undermining the Bronze Age world system from within. The historian Eric Klein, in his influential book published in 2014, argued persuasively that no single factor caused the Bronze Age collapse. Instead, it was a systems collapse, a cascading failure in which multiple stressors, any one of which might have been survivable on its own, combined to overwhelm the interconnected civilizations that depended on each other for essential resources and economic stability. The lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is not merely historical, it is structural. The very features that made the late Bronze Age world system so productive and so dynamic, its interconnection, its specialization, its mutual dependency, its long-distance supply chains, were precisely the features that made it vulnerable to cascading failure. When each city depends on trade with a dozen others for essential materials, the failure of one city sends shockwaves through the entire network. When craftsmen specialize so deeply that they can produce bronze but cannot feed themselves without grain from distant suppliers, the disruption of supply lines becomes an existential threat. The interconnection that creates prosperity in stable times becomes a vector of destruction in unstable ones. This is a pattern that should be studied by anyone who depends, as we all do, on global supply chains for the basic necessities of life. The Bronze Age world discovered that complexity beyond a certain threshold, creates fragility. The Olmec, operating in a different context but facing analogous pressures, may have learned the same lesson. The parallel with the Olmec is instructive, though indirect and imperfect. The Olmec, like the Bronze Age Mediterranean civilizations, existed within a network of trade and cultural exchange that connected diverse communities across a wide region. The Olmec heartland exported not just material goods, but ideas, artistic styles, religious concepts, and possibly institutional models to communities across Mesoamerica. When the Olmec centers declined, the network did not collapse as catastrophically as the Bronze Age system. Instead, the center of gravity shifted. New centers emerged in other regions, in Oaxaca, in the Maya lowlands, in the Valley of Mexico, drawing on the Olmec legacy but developing in their own distinctive directions. The Olmec model was not destroyed by a single catastrophic event. It was dispersed, distributed, and absorbed. Consider next the case of Göbekli Tepe, a site in southeastern Turkey that has shaken our understanding of early human society and the relationship between religion, architecture, and the development of agriculture. Göbekli Tepe consists of massive T-shaped stone pillars, some over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, carved with images of animals, foxes, boars, snakes, vultures, scorpions, lions, and arranged in circular enclosures on a hilltop overlooking the Harran Plain. According to current archaeological estimates, the site was built roughly 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, which places it firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic period, before the invention of pottery, before the domestication of most plants and animals, and before the development of settled agricultural communities. In other words, Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, people who, according to the conventional model of human cultural development, should not have had the social organization, the surplus labor, or the ideological motivation necessary for monumental construction. The site was excavated beginning in 1995 by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, whose work over the next 2 decades revealed a complex of stone enclosures that challenged fundamental assumptions about the sequence of human cultural development. The conventional model held that agriculture came first, then permanent settlement, then surplus production, then social stratification, then organized religion, then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe inverted this sequence. Here was monumental architecture, here was organized religion, and it preceded agriculture. Schmidt argued that it was not farming that led to temples, but temples that led to farming. The desire to build and maintain sacred sites like Göbekli Tepe, he proposed, may have motivated the transition to agriculture, as the need to feed the workers and pilgrims who gathered at the site created pressure to develop more reliable food sources. And here is what makes Göbekli Tepe relevant to our story of the Olmec. Around 8,000 before the Common Era, the site was deliberately buried. The builders, or their descendants, filled in the stone enclosures with earth, rubble, and refuse, covering the carved pillars and closing the site. Why? We do not know. The burial appears to have been intentional, even careful, suggesting that it was a deliberate act of ritual closure rather than a response to some external catastrophe. The patterns at San Lorenzo, where Olmec monuments were systematically defaced and buried around 900 before the Common Era, echo across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. There is something in the human relationship with sacred sites, some impulse toward deliberate ending, toward the intentional closure of a sacred chapter that connects these distant events across time and space. Perhaps it is the recognition that sacred things must not be allowed to decay into mundanity. Perhaps it is the belief that power, once activated, must be properly decommissioned. Perhaps it is simply the recognition that all things end, and that a good ending is better than a slow decline. Then there is Cahokia, the forgotten metropolis of the Mississippi Valley. Located near present-day St. Louis, Missouri, on the floodplain of the Mississippi River, Cahokia was the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico. At its peak, around the year 1100 of the Common Era, Cahokia had a population estimated at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, with some scholars suggesting even higher numbers when the surrounding communities are included. Its centerpiece was Monk's Mound, a massive earthen platform roughly 30 meters tall and covering an area of about 5.5 hectares at its base, making it the largest earthen structure in the Americas and one of the largest anywhere in the world. Cahokia had grand plazas, residential neighborhoods, craft workshops, and a wooden circle of large posts, dubbed Woodhenge by archaeologists, in a nod to the more famous stone circle in England that appears to have served as a solar calendar. Its posts aligned to mark the positions of the sunrise at the equinoxes and solstices. The people of Cahokia engaged in long-distance trade networks that brought marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes region, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains. They practiced elaborate ceremonial activities, including large-scale feasting, and, based on evidence from a mass burial known as Mound 72, human sacrifice. The excavation of Mound 72 revealed the remains of over 270 individuals, many of them young women who appeared to have been killed as part of a burial ceremony for a high-status male who was interred on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon or thunderbird. The scale of the sacrifice and the care with which it was orchestrated speaks to a society with sharp social stratification and absolute authority vested in its leaders, characteristics shared with the Olmec and other early complex societies. They organized their society around a complex system of social hierarchy, with a ruling elite who lived on or near the great mounds and a general population spread across the surrounding communities. Cahokia also presents us with an environmental cautionary tale that echoes the Olmec experience. Some researchers have suggested that the Cahokians may have contributed to their own decline through deforestation. The massive construction projects at Cahokia required enormous quantities of timber for the stockade wall that surrounded the central precinct, for the buildings that stood atop the mounds, for fuel, for the construction of Woodhenge. The clearing of forests in the surrounding uplands may have increased erosion, sedimentation, and flooding in the bottomlands where the city was located, degrading the agricultural land that fed the population. If this hypothesis is correct, then Cahokia, like the Olmec heartland, may have been undone in part by the environmental consequences of its own success, a pattern that appears again and again in the history of complex societies, pushing against the limits of their resource base. And then, by the late 1300s, Cahokia was abandoned, the population dispersed, the great mounds stood empty. The plazas where thousands had gathered for ceremonies grew over with grass and trees. When European explorers arrived in the Mississippi Valley in the 16th and 17th centuries, the mounds were already ancient, already mysterious, and the people living in the region had only fragmentary traditions about who had built them. Some early European observers refused to believe that the mounds had been built by Native Americans at all, attributing them instead to a mythical mound builder race, perhaps the lost tribes of Israel, or Vikings, or some other group from the Old World. This mound builder myth, rooted in racism and a stubborn refusal to credit indigenous peoples with the capacity for monumental construction, persisted well into the 19th century, until systematic archaeological work by Cyrus Thomas and others at the Smithsonian Institution definitively demonstrated that the mounds had been built by the ancestors of the very people the Europeans had encountered and dispossessed. The mound builder myth is relevant to the Olmec story because it illustrates a broader pattern in how dominant cultures respond to the achievements of peoples they consider inferior or primitive. When the colossal heads of the Olmec were first discovered and publicized, some observers, noting the broad noses and full lips of the carved faces, speculated that the Olmec were of African origin, perhaps Egyptians or Nubians, who had crossed the Atlantic and established a colony in the Americas. This theory, which has been thoroughly discredited by decades of archaeological, genetic, and linguistic evidence, showing that the Olmec were indigenous Mesoamerican people, persists in some popular circles to this day. It reflects the same fundamental inability to credit indigenous American peoples with the capacity for independent, original, monumental achievement that produced the mound builder myth. The Olmec were not African or Egyptian or Phoenician. They were the people of the Gulf Coast, rooted in their landscape, drawing on their own traditions, creating their own solutions to the challenges of their environment. And their achievements, far from being derivative or imported, were original, creative, and foundational in ways that even their most ardent admirers are still working to fully understand. The math is striking when you consider all of these cases together. Across the world, across thousands of years, the pattern repeats with eerie consistency. Complex societies rise. They build. They create art and architecture of extraordinary sophistication. They develop trade networks, religious systems, political structures, and technologies that represent the accumulated knowledge and effort of generations. They sustain themselves for centuries. And then they decline, sometimes slowly, sometimes rapidly, and the memory of what they were fades until the ruins themselves become mysteries to later generations. The Indus Valley civilization lasted roughly 700 years. The Olmec lasted roughly 1,000. The ancestral Puebloans, from their earliest beginnings to their final abandonment of the great centers, lasted over 1,000 years. Cahokia's peak lasted roughly 200 to 300 years. Angkor flourished for roughly 600 years. These are not trivial swaths of time. These are durations that exceed the lifespan of many modern nations, and yet all of them ended. All of them were, to varying degrees, forgotten. But the Olmec case has a feature that sets it apart from most of these examples and makes it uniquely troubling. In most cases of civilizational collapse, the successor cultures retain at least some memory of their predecessors. The modern Pueblo peoples remember their ancestral Puebloan heritage and maintain oral traditions about the Great Migrations. The Cambodians never entirely forgot Angkor, even if the full scope of the ancient city had been lost from popular memory by the time the French arrived. The Egyptians recorded their encounters with the Sea Peoples in elaborate relief carvings and inscriptions that survived for millennia. Even at Göbekli Tepe, the deliberate burial of the site suggests that the builders themselves chose the moment of ending, that the transition was managed, that some agency was preserved. But the Olmec were forgotten, truly, deeply, completely forgotten. Not just by distant cultures or foreign observers, but by the very civilizations that inherited their legacy and built upon their foundations. The Maya, who constructed their great cities at Tikal and Palenque and Copan, using architectural principles, religious concepts, and artistic conventions that the Olmec had pioneered, do not appear to have remembered the Olmec by name or by story. The Aztec, who would inherit many of the same traditions through intermediate cultures like the Toltec and Teotihuacan, knew nothing of the people who had started it all. The word Olmec itself is an Aztec Nahuatl term, meaning rubber people, but the Aztec applied it to the contemporary inhabitants of the Gulf Coast region, not to the ancient civilization we now associate with the name. The ancient Olmec, the people of the colossal heads and the jade offerings and the buried serpentine mosaics, were, until modern archaeology unearthed their remains, completely and utterly forgotten by the very world they had helped to create. A civilization can collapse and be remembered. Rome fell, but we remember Rome. We read its literature, we study its laws, we walk its roads. A civilization can be conquered and still survive in memory. The Aztec were destroyed by the Spanish, but Aztec history was recorded by indigenous and Spanish chroniclers. And Aztec culture lives on in the traditions, languages, and identities of millions of people in modern Mexico. But the Olmecs suffered something worse than collapse or conquest. They suffered erasure. Their contribution to Mesoamerican civilization was absorbed so completely into the cultures that followed that the source was forgotten. The river was still flowing, strong and wide, and carrying the waters of 1,000 tributaries. But no one remembered the spring. There is a deeper truth beneath the Olmec mystery, one that extends far beyond the swamps of Veracruz and Tabasco, far beyond the boundaries of Mesoamerica, far beyond the concerns of professional archaeology, and reaches into the most fundamental questions about human civilization and the fragility of human memory. It is a truth that once seen cannot be unseen. And it begins with a simple observation that carries enormous weight. We are proud of our knowledge. We are proud of our libraries, our databases, our cloud storage, our digital archives, our search engines that can retrieve any fact in fractions of a second. We believe that we live in an age of unprecedented information preservation, that the sum of human knowledge is growing every day, that the things we know and create and discover will endure because we have the technology to save them in ways that previous generations could not have imagined. We take it as an article of faith that the digital revolution has solved the problem of memory, that the internet is forever, that the cloud remembers everything. But the Olmec had no such illusions, and perhaps they were wiser for it. They carved their most important messages in stone, one of the most durable materials available in the natural world. They buried their most sacred offerings deep in the earth, protected by layers of clay and sand and rubble. They built their monuments to last for millennia, and they were right about the stone. The colossal heads have survived for 3,000 years. But they were wrong about memory. The faces survived, but the names were lost. The monuments endured, but the stories they told were forgotten. The stone lasted, but the meaning bled away. Let that sink in. If a civilization that lasted 1,000 years, that built monuments weighing tens of tons from one of the hardest stones on Earth, that influenced an entire hemisphere, that laid the foundations for every major culture that would follow it in Mesoamerica, can be erased so thoroughly from human memory that even its name is an invention of modern scholars based on an unrelated Aztec word, then what does that tell us about the permanence of our own achievements? What does that tell us about the durability of our own knowledge, our own stories, our own names? We store our information on hard drives that degrade within decades, their magnetic fields weakening with each passing year. We save our data in file formats that become obsolete within a few years, replaced by new standards that cannot always read the old ones. We depend on electrical grids, server farms, undersea cables, and satellite networks that are vulnerable to solar storms, electromagnetic pulses, cyber attacks, infrastructure decay, political instability, and simple mechanical failure. The average website lasts less than 10 years before its content is altered or lost. The average digital storage medium lasts less than 50 years before it becomes unreliable. The Olmec colossal heads have survived for 3,000 years. Our selfies, our social media posts, our entire digital lives may not survive 30. This is not science fiction. This is the documented reality of information decay in the modern world. The computer scientist Vint Cerf, widely recognized as one of the engineers who helped create the internet, has publicly warned of what he calls a digital dark age, a period in the future when vast amounts of digital information become inaccessible, because the hardware needed to read them is no longer manufactured, the software needed to interpret them is no longer supported, and the file formats in which they were encoded are no longer understood. This is already happening. Government records stored on magnetic tape in formats from the 1970s and 80s are becoming unreadable. Scientific datasets from earlier decades containing irreplaceable observations are locked in obsolete databases. Personal photographs, family histories, letters, journals, the stuff of individual human memory are stored on floppy disks, zip drives, and CD-ROMs that modern computers cannot read. We are already losing data. Not through malice or neglect, but through the simple, relentless, impersonal process of technological obsolescence. Consider a specific example that brings this home with uncomfortable clarity. NASA's early satellite data, observations of the Earth's atmosphere and surface, collected in the 1960s and 70s, data that would be invaluable for studying long-term climate patterns and environmental change, was stored on magnetic tapes in formats designed for mainframe computers that no longer exist. When researchers in the 2000s attempted to access this data, they discovered that much of it was degraded beyond recovery. The magnetic signals on the tapes had faded. The tape drives needed to read them had been scrapped. The software needed to decode the data formats had been lost. Decades of irreplaceable scientific observations, paid for with billions of dollars of public investment, were gone, not destroyed by fire or war or natural disaster, but simply abandoned in a closet while the technology needed to read them became extinct. The Olmec at least had the advantage of working in stone. We are working in light, in electrical impulses, in magnetic orientations on spinning disks that will one day stop spinning and never start again. But the deeper lesson of the Olmec is not about technology or media or storage formats. It is about memory itself, human memory, cultural memory, civilizational memory. These are not permanent features of the world, not immutable records inscribed on some cosmic hard drive. They are processes, active processes, living processes. They require energy, attention, and intention to maintain. A story that is not told is forgotten. A name that is not spoken falls silent. A tradition that is not practiced dies. A language that is not taught to children ceases to exist within a generation. Memory is not a thing. It is an activity. And when the activity stops, the memory stops with it. Think about how cultural memory actually works in practice, stripped of romantic abstraction. An elder sits with a child by a fire, or in a temple, or in a workshop, and tells a story, explains a technique, names the stars, recounts the deeds of ancestors. The child listens. The child remembers. Decades later, the child, now an elder, sits with a new child and repeats the process. If this happens without interruption for 1,000 years, the chain holds. The memory persists. But the chain is made of individual human lives, each one fragile, each one mortal, each one subject to the 10,000 contingencies that can silence a voice before it has finished speaking. War, disease, famine, migration, a bad harvest that forces a family to scatter, a raid that kills the storytellers before the stories have been passed on, a generation that turns its attention elsewhere and neglects the old knowledge in favor of the new. It does not take a catastrophe to break the chain. It takes one generation. One single generation in which the stories are not told, the skills are not taught, the names are not spoken. After that, the chain is broken, and everything that depended on its continuity begins to fade. First the details go, then the names, then the stories themselves, reduced to fragments and feelings. Then even the fragments dissolve, and what remains is silence, and a few stones that no one remembers how to read. The Olmec did not lose their civilization because their monuments were destroyed, though many were defaced. They did not lose it because their cities were abandoned, though they were. They did not lose it because some external enemy conquered them and deliberately suppressed their identity, though we cannot rule this out entirely. They lost it because the chain of memory that connected them to the future was broken. Somewhere at some point, the last person who knew an Olmec story told it for the last time. The last person who remembered an Olmec king spoke that king's name for the last time. The last person who understood the meaning of the word jaguar in its original Olmec context died without passing that understanding on. And when that happened, the Olmec ceased to exist in human memory. They became archaeological artifacts, objects without context, faces without names. A civilization reduced to a collection of museum pieces and academic papers. The people who came after the Olmec inherited their ideas, their symbols, their practices, but not their stories. The content was preserved, the attribution was lost. And without attribution, without the connection between an idea and the person or people who created it, the creators ceased to exist in human memory. This is what happened to the Olmec. They were not conquered by foreign enemies. They were not annihilated by plague or famine. They were absorbed, digested, incorporated into the body of Mesoamerican civilization so completely that the original form was dissolved beyond recognition. Their jade offerings were buried by later peoples who did not know who had first taught them to value jade. Their jaguar imagery was painted on the walls of Maya temples by artists who did not know who had first imagined the fusion of human and feline. Their calendar was refined by Zapotec and Maya astronomers who did not know who had first counted the days and assigned them names and meanings. The Olmec did not die. They became invisible. Let that sink in. This is what it means to be the mother civilization. It means giving birth to traditions that outlive you and then outgrow you and then forget you. It means contributing so deeply to the cultures that follow that your contribution becomes indistinguishable from the fabric of the world, like water poured into a river, forever part of the current, but no longer identifiable as a separate stream. It means being so successful in transmitting your ideas that the very success of the transmission erases the transmitter. The Olmec are the ultimate example of what might be called productive self-erasure, a civilization that was so influential, so foundational, so deeply embedded in everything that came after it, that it disappeared into its own influence. And this raises a question that should trouble anyone who thinks seriously about the human past and the human future. How many other mother civilizations are there? How many other foundational cultures have been absorbed so completely into the traditions that followed them that we have no record of their existence, no archaeological trace, no surviving artifact, no memory at all? The Olmec were fortunate, if that is the right word, in that they carved colossal heads from basalt and buried offerings of jade and serpentine, materials durable enough to survive 3,000 years of tropical decay. But what about cultures that built in wood, in bamboo, in woven reeds, in materials that the earth consumed within decades? What about cultures that existed in environments even more destructive than the Gulf Coast swamps? In tropical forests where even stone can be dissolved by centuries of acidic rainfall, in river deltas where entire landscapes are periodically erased by floods. Consider the Amazon basin. For most of the 20th century, the conventional archaeological wisdom held that the Amazon rainforest was a counterfeit paradise, a term coined by the anthropologist Betty Meggers, who argued that the poor soils of the tropical forest could not support large populations or complex societies. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon were seen as small, scattered groups living in simple villages, practicing slash-and-burn agriculture on a small scale. Then, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating in the 2000s, researchers began to discover evidence that challenged this view in ways that were as dramatic as they were unexpected. Across the Amazon basin, archaeologists found extensive areas of terra preta, dark earth, a type of anthropogenic soil created and enriched by sustained human activity that was far more fertile than the natural tropical soils around it. These deposits covered enormous areas, some stretching for hectares, and they appeared to have been created over centuries of intentional soil management, involving the systematic burning of plant material, the incorporation of charcoal, pottery fragments, fish bones, and organic waste, and possibly the deliberate cultivation of specific microbial communities that enhance soil fertility. This was not simple gardening on a small plot. This was landscape engineering on a scale that implied large, organized populations working together over many generations. The evidence continued to accumulate. Satellite imagery and aerial surveys using LiDAR technology, a laser scanning system that can penetrate forest canopy and map the ground surface beneath, revealed the outlines of earthworks, roads, plazas, ditches, and geometric enclosures hidden beneath the Amazon jungle in areas where dense forest had concealed them from ground-level observation. In the Llanos de Mojos region of Bolivia, researchers documented extensive raised field systems, causeways, artificial mounds, and fish weirs that covered thousands of square kilometers and suggested a large, organized population engaged in sophisticated water and land management. In the Upper Xingu region of Brazil, the archaeologist Michael Heckenberger documented a network of connected villages, linked by broad, straight roads and organized around large central plazas that he compared in complexity to a medieval European town plan. The implications were profound. The Amazon, far from being a pristine wilderness untouched by human hands, appeared to have been home to large, complex societies that had managed and transformed the landscape on a vast scale. And these societies, whatever they were, whatever they called themselves, however they organized their politics and their religion and their daily lives, had left almost no monumental architecture, no stone carvings, no durable written record. They had built in wood, earth, and plant fibers, materials that the tropical environment consumed within a generation or two. They had created complex societies whose physical traces were almost entirely erased by the forest. If it had not been for the terra preta, the earthworks visible only from aircraft or satellites, and the persistence of a few researchers willing to challenge the established consensus, these civilizations might never have been recognized at all. How many other civilizations lie hidden? How many other foundational societies, mother cultures, whose ideas shaped the traditions of entire regions and entire continents, have been lost, not because they were unimportant, but because the materials they used, the environments they inhabited, and the mechanisms of cultural transmission they employed left no trace that could survive the millennia. The Olmec challenge is not just about one civilization in the swamps of Mexico. It is about the fundamental incompleteness of the human record. It is about the high probability that the story of human civilization, as we understand it from the archaeological evidence, is missing entire chapters, entire volumes, entire libraries of achievement and experience that have been consumed by time. The archaeologist David Stewart, a specialist in Maya epigraphy, once reflected on the fact that the known inscriptions of the Maya represent only a tiny fraction of the texts that once existed. The vast majority of Maya books, written on bark paper and coated with lime plaster to create a smooth writing surface, were destroyed either by the natural decay of tropical conditions or by the deliberate burning carried out by Spanish missionaries in the 16th century. The notorious burning at Mani in 1562, directed by the Franciscan friar Diego de Landa, destroyed an unknown number of Maya manuscripts, each one potentially containing centuries of historical, astronomical, mathematical, and religious knowledge accumulated by generations of scribes and scholars. Only 4 Maya codices survive today. 4, out of what must have been thousands, possibly tens of thousands. We know the Maya were literate because their inscriptions cover their monuments, and their surviving books are marvels of calligraphy and illustration. But we have lost 99% or more of their written output. The pages that survived are a whisper. The pages that burned were a roar we will never hear. If this is what happened to the Maya, a civilization that survived as a living culture into the colonial period, and whose descendants number in the millions today, then imagine what happened to the Olmec, who preceded the Maya by centuries and who disappeared as a distinct cultural entity long before anyone from the literate Old World arrived to record their existence. The Olmec literary tradition, if it existed, and the Cascajol block suggests it may have, is not merely incomplete, it is gone. Every book, every scroll, every painted text, every recorded thought, every poem, every prayer, every astronomical observation, every king's name inscribed on bark or cloth, has been consumed by time, humidity, insects, fungi, and the indifferent chemistry of tropical decay. We are not missing 99% of the Olmec written record. We are missing all of it except a single block of stone, bearing 62 symbols that no one can read. That block is not a fragment of a library. It is the only word left in a language that has been silenced. And this loss is not unique to the Olmec, nor even to the Americas. It is the default condition of human history across the entire world. The vast majority of everything that human beings have ever thought, said, created, and believed is gone. Lost forever. Not stored in some cosmic archive waiting to be accessed, but genuinely, irrevocably, permanently gone. The archaeological record preserves a thin, biased, fragmentary sample of the human past, skewed toward durable materials like stone and metal, toward favorable preservation environments like deserts and frozen tundra, and toward cultures that happened to be noticed by literate observers at the right moment. What we call history is what survived the filter. What we call prehistory is everything that did not leave a written trace, a category that encompasses the vast majority of human experience across the vast majority of human time on Earth. And the boundary between the two is not a measure of human achievement or importance. It is a measure of luck, of circumstance, of the accident of preservation. Whole worlds of human experience have been swallowed without a trace. This is the deeper truth. Human civilization is not a permanent edifice built on solid ground. It is a garden planted in sand. What does the Olmec story mean for us? This is not an academic question, not a matter of interest only to archaeologists and historians sitting in university offices, surrounded by pottery fragments and research papers. It is a question that touches the deepest concerns of anyone who has ever built something, created something, taught something, or loved something enough to want it to last beyond the span of a single life. We live in a civilization that is, by any conventional measure, the most complex, most interconnected, most productive, and most information-rich in human history. Our cities span continents. Our communication networks circle the globe at the speed of light. Our knowledge base encompasses everything from the behavior of subatomic particles to the structure of galaxies billions of light years away. We produce more information in a single day than the entire ancient world produced in a century. We have technologies that previous generations could not have conceived, let alone built. And we believe, with a confidence that borders on unexamined faith, that this will endure, that our civilization is different from all the ones that came before, that the internet will remember, that the cloud will preserve, that the server farms will keep humming, and the satellites will keep orbiting, and the fiber optic cables will keep carrying their streams of light, and the data, the precious, irreplaceable data that contains our science, our art, our history, our identities, our very selves, will keep flowing forever. But the Olmec believed their monuments would endure too. They carved their rulers' faces in basalt, one of the hardest natural stones on Earth, a rock formed from volcanic lava that resists weathering better than almost any other material available to pre-industrial peoples. They buried their offerings in arrangements so careful, so precise, so rich in symbolic meaning, that they must have believed those offerings would matter for eternity, or at least for as long as the earth endured. And they were right about the stone. The colossal heads have survived for 3,000 years and will likely survive for thousands more. But they were wrong about memory. The faces survived, but the names were lost. The monuments endured, but the stories they once told were forgotten. The stone lasted, but the meaning it was meant to carry bled away, leaving only the bare, mute, beautiful fact of the object itself. There is a concept in information theory called bit rot, the gradual degradation of stored information over time. In the digital world, bit rot refers to the physical processes that corrupt stored data. Magnetic fields weakening on hard drives, charge leaking from flash memory cells, optical coatings degrading on compact discs. But the concept applies, metaphorically and precisely, to cultural information as well. Stories degrade as they are passed from generation to generation. Details are changed. Names are forgotten. Context is stripped away. Nuance is lost. What begins as a precise historical account becomes a legend. The legend becomes a myth. The myth becomes a vague tradition. The tradition becomes a feeling, a sense of something half-remembered, a fragment of melody without words. And finally, even the feeling fades, and what remains is silence. The Olmec experienced the ultimate bit rot. Their cultural information degraded so completely that not even the faintest echo of their identity survived in the oral traditions of the cultures that succeeded them and owed them so much. This should give us pause. Not because our civilization is about to collapse tomorrow, though it is worth noting that no civilization in history has expected its own collapse, and most would have been offended by the suggestion, but because the mechanisms of cultural memory that we rely on, the institutions, the technologies, the practices that we trust to preserve our knowledge and our identity are not as robust as we casually assume them to be. We depend on institutions, universities, libraries, archives, museums, government record offices to preserve our collective memory. But institutions are human creations, and they are subject to the same forces of decline, disruption, and dissolution that affect all human creations. The Library of Alexandria, perhaps the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, was destroyed not in a single dramatic fire as popular legend holds, but through centuries of neglect, conflict, and institutional decay. The monasteries of medieval Europe, which preserved much of the classical literary heritage through the centuries following the fall of Rome, came close to being wiped out during the Viking raids of the 9th and 10th centuries. The great libraries of Baghdad, which housed the accumulated learning of the Islamic Golden Age, were destroyed when the Mongols sacked the city in 1258. The Maya codices were burned by Spanish priests. Every age has its own form of cultural destruction, its own particular way of breaking the chain of memory. Ours may be the quiet, invisible, bloodless destruction of digital obsolescence, the slow death of information stored in formats that become unreadable, on media that become unplayable, in systems that become unsupportable. There is also a philosophical dimension to the Olmec story that repays careful reflection. The Olmec remind us that civilizational achievement is not the same as civilizational permanence. These are two very different things, and we habitually confuse them. You can build pyramids and still be forgotten. You can invent a calendar and still lose your name. You can shape the cultural landscape of an entire hemisphere and still vanish so completely that future generations do not know you existed. Achievement and memory are not the same thing. The one does not guarantee the other. History is not a meritocracy of memory, where the greatest achievements are automatically preserved and the lesser ones are justly forgotten. History is a filter, and the filter is not designed. It is random, brutal, and indifferent to quality. What survives is what happens to be made of durable materials, what happens to be located in a favorable environment, what happens to be noticed by someone who happens to have the means and the motivation to preserve it. The rest is lost. Not because it was unimportant, but because the circumstances of its survival were not favorable. And yet there is something deeply, unexpectedly hopeful in the Olmec story as well. Because even though the Olmec were forgotten as a people, their contributions were not entirely lost. Before we discuss that hope, though, there is an uncomfortable ethical dimension to the Olmec story that demands acknowledgement. When we speak of the Olmec as lost or forgotten, we are speaking from a particular perspective, the perspective of academic archaeology, of Western historical consciousness, of a tradition that measures memory in written records and datable artifacts. But the Olmec were not lost in a vacuum. They were lost to us, to the literate, documenting, categorizing tradition of modern scholarship. The question of whether they were ever truly lost to everyone is more complicated than it might appear. The Mixi and Zoque peoples of Oaxaca and Chiapas, who linguistic evidence suggests may be the close modern relatives of the ancient Olmec, have their own oral traditions, their own ways of understanding their place in the world, their own forms of memory that do not depend on peer-reviewed publications or museum collections. When we say the Olmec were forgotten, we mean that their specific historical identity was forgotten within the framework of literate history. We do not mean, and should not presume to mean, that every trace of their existence vanished from every form of human consciousness. The Mixi and Zoque peoples are still here. They still speak languages that may descend from the language the Olmec spoke. They still inhabit landscapes that overlap with the ancient Olmec world. The question of what they remember and how they remember it and what forms their memory takes is a question that belongs to them, not to us. This matters because the history of archaeology in the Americas is also, inescapably, a history of colonialism. The very act of discovering the Olmec, of naming them, categorizing them, placing them in a timeline designed by European scholars using European conventions, was an act of intellectual appropriation, however well-intentioned. The Olmec did not name themselves the Olmec. They did not ask to be studied. They did not consent to have their offerings excavated, their monuments placed in museums, their religious practices dissected in academic papers. They are, in a very real sense, the subjects of a conversation they cannot participate in, analysed by people whose cultural assumptions and intellectual frameworks would have been utterly foreign to them. This does not mean that the archaeological study of the Olmec is illegitimate or should stop. Knowledge is valuable, and understanding the human past is a worthy endeavour. But it does mean that we should approach the Olmec with humility, with an awareness that our interpretations are provisional, that our categories may not map onto their reality, and that our fascination with them, however genuine, is also a form of possession. The ball game they created, or at least perfected and formalized, was played across Mesoamerica for 2,000 years. The religious imagery they developed, the jaguar, the feathered serpent, the rain deity, echoed through every subsequent civilization. The calendrical concepts they pioneered were refined into some of the most precise timekeeping systems in the ancient world. The artistic traditions they established produced some of the finest sculptural art in all of human history. The Olmec did not survive as a recognizable entity, but what they created survived in transformed, unattributed, but very much living forms. It was changed, it was adapted, it was elaborated and reimagined by cultures that did not know its origin, but it lived on. Perhaps this is the most honest, most mature way to think about civilizational legacy. not as a monument that stands forever, unchanged and clearly labelled with the name of its builder, but as a contribution to a river that flows on, carrying fragments and dissolved elements of every tradition that has ever poured into it, mixing and merging and transforming them into something new, something that belongs to no single source, but contains traces of everyone. The Olmec are in the water. They are in the ball games played on 1,000 courts across 2,000 years. They are in the jade masks placed over the faces of Maya kings. They are in the jaguar thrones of Aztec emperors. They are in the calendar that counted the days and the years and the great cycles of time. They are in the very idea that a civilization can rise from a swamp, that human beings can organize themselves to move 50-ton stones across 80 kilometers of wetland without wheels or animals, that art and religion and monumental architecture can emerge from the most challenging, most inhospitable, most unlikely of environments. The swamps of Veracruz are quiet now. The rivers still flow, brown and slow and heavy with silt, through the lowlands where the Olmec once built their cities and carved their kings' faces i stone. The jungle has grown back over the ruins, though not completely. Here and there, a mound rises above the flat green landscape, the last visible trace of a platform or a pyramid, its shape softened by centuries of rain and root growth, and the slow accumulation of soil. The colossal heads, the ones that have been found, and there may yet be others waiting beneath the mud, are in museums now, in Villahermosa and Jalapa and Mexico City, standing in air-conditioned galleries, staring at visitors with the same calm, inscrutable, faintly sorrowful expressions they wore when they were first carved 3,000 years ago. They do not answer questions. They do not explain themselves. They do not reveal the names of the rulers they depict, or the rituals that surrounded their creation, or the reasons they were eventually defaced and buried. They simply watch and wait and endure. If you ever have the chance to visit the Museo de Antropología de Jalapa in Veracruz, or the Parque Museo La Venta in Villahermosa, where colossal heads and other Olmec monuments are displayed in an outdoor garden setting surrounded by tropical vegetation, take it. Stand in front of one of those heads. Stand close enough to see the grain of the basalt, the individual tool marks left by the sculptor's stone chisel, the faint weathering of 3,000 years of sun and rain and wind. Look at the face. Not at it as an artifact, not at it as a data point in an archaeological survey, but at it as a face, a human face. A face that once belonged to someone's father, someone's son, someone's ruler, someone's god on earth. A face that someone carved with love, or with fear, or with duty, or with some emotion for which we have no name, grinding away at volcanic rock for month after month, shaping the curve of a cheek, the line of a lip, the weight of an eyelid, until the stone became a person. And then consider that you are looking at someone whose name has been erased as completely as if it had never been spoken. You are looking at a monument to human achievement that is, simultaneously, a monument to human impermanence. You are looking at 3,000 years of silence, wearing a human face. The Olmec were the beginning of something vast, the beginning of a tradition that would produce the pyramids of Teotihuacan, the painted murals of Bonampak, the astronomical tables of the Maya, the codices of the Mixtec, the great market of Tlatelolco, the empire of the Aztec. They were the first in Mesoamerica to take the raw materials of human existence in the tropical lowlands, the maize, the jade, the rubber, the rivers, the rain, the jungle, the jaguar that padded through the darkness at the edge of the village, and shape them into something greater than survival. They built a civilization. They gave it form and beauty and meaning and power. They developed ideas and images and practices that would echo through the centuries for 2,000 years after their own time ended. And they passed it on, not through conquest or empire, but through the quiet, persistent, invisible influence of their ideas, their art, their way of seeing and organizing and sanctifying the world. They did not know they were the beginning. No civilization ever does. The people who carved the colossal heads at San Lorenzo did not think of themselves as pioneers laying the foundations for cultures yet unborn. They thought of themselves as the center of the world, as the people living in the place where earth and sky and water converged, doing what their ancestors had done and their children would continue to do. They built their monuments not for future archaeologists, but for their own gods, their own rulers, their own understanding of how the cosmos was structured and what obligations human beings owed to the powers that sustained them. They did not plan to be forgotten. No one plans to be forgotten. They did not plan to be the invisible foundation beneath 2,000 years of cultural achievement. They were simply doing what human beings do when circumstances allow and imagination commands. Building, creating, trying to make something that matters, trying to leave a mark on the world that says, "We were here, and what we did meant something, and the story is not over." That is something worth remembering in a narrative so saturated with loss and forgetting. The Olmec heartland has not been fully explored. Modern technology, LiDAR surveys that can penetrate jungle canopy and map ground surfaces with centimeter precision, ground-penetrating radar that can detect buried structures without excavation, satellite imagery that can identify subtle variations in vegetation and soil moisture that mark the locations of ancient settlements, is revealing features that previous generations of archaeologists could never have detected. In 2019, research using LiDAR in the region between the Olmec heartland and the Maya lowlands discovered a massive ceremonial complex at a site called Aguada Phoenix in Tabasco, dating to roughly 1000 before the Common Era. That represents one of the largest ancient structures ever found in Mesoamerica. The site, which had been almost invisible from ground level, sprawls across nearly 1.5 kilometers and appears to have been built by a community that blended Olmec and early Maya traditions, providing new evidence for the mechanisms by which Olmec cultural influence was transmitted to the east. There may be dozens of similar sites hidden beneath the vegetation of the Gulf Coast, waiting for the right technology and the right questions to bring them to light. Every year, the picture becomes a little clearer. Every season of fieldwork adds a few more pieces to the puzzle. Every new technique, every new analytical method, every new way of extracting information from soil and stone and bone and botanical remains pushes back the boundaries of our ignorance by a few more centimeters. We will never know everything about the Olmec. We will never read their thoughts or hear their voices, or learn the names of the kings whose faces stare at us from the museums of Villahermosa and Jalapa. But we will know more tomorrow than we know today. And the more we know, the more fully we can appreciate the magnitude of what they achieved and the depth of what was lost. And they succeeded, more than they could have imagined, more than anyone knew until modern archaeology, with its radiocarbon dates and its stratigraphic analysis, and its patient and trowels scraping through layers of clay and silt, began to piece together the scattered fragments of their legacy. The Olmec influence runs through Mesoamerican civilization like a vein through limestone, invisible on the surface but structural, load-bearing, essential, carrying the weight of everything built above it. Remove the Olmec from the story, and the story of the Americas changes in ways we can barely calculate. Remove the ballgame, the calendar, the jaguar symbolism, the tradition of monumental stone carving, the concept of the ceremonial center as a sacred landscape, the practice of burying offerings to sanctify the earth, and the cultures that followed, the Maya, the Zapotec, the Mixtec, the Toltec, the Aztec, become unrecognizable. They become different civilizations, perhaps still great, perhaps still creative, but fundamentally different from what they actually were. The Olmec did not merely contribute to Mesoamerican civilization. In a very real sense, they made it possible. They were the source code. And the programs that ran on that code, the civilizations that flourished for 2,000 years after the Olmec heartland fell silent, never knew that the code existed, and yet they were forgotten. This is the thought that stays with you. Long after the facts and dates have faded from memory, long after the names of archaeologists and the locations of sites have blurred into a general impression of jungle and stone, a people so important that their ideas shaped half a continent for 2 millennia, a people so forgotten that their name is a label applied by strangers who lived thousands of years later and hundreds of kilometers away, a people so thoroughly erased from the living memory of their own descendants and heirs, that when their monuments were first discovered, protruding from the mud of a Veracruz swamp in 1862. No one in the world knew who had made them. The Olmec are a reminder carved in basalt, a reminder that everything human is temporary, that even the greatest achievements can be swallowed by time, that the chain of memory connecting us to our ancestors is thinner and more fragile than we like to believe. They are a reminder that civilization is not an achievement that can be completed and set aside, like a trophy placed on a shelf. It is a process, an ongoing effort, a fire that must be fed every day or it goes out. The moment we stop tending it, the moment we stop telling our stories and teaching our children and maintaining our institutions and caring for our knowledge, the jungle returns. It always returns. It is patient, it has time, it can wait. But the Olmec are also a promise, a quiet melancholy but real promise. A promise that what we create can outlive us, even if our names do not travel with it. A promise that the ideas we plant can grow into forests we will never see. A promise that influence, true influence, the kind that reshapes the world, does not require fame or recognition or the survival of a single name in a single text. The Olmec are unknown, but they are not gone. They are in every ball court where a rubber ball strikes stone. They are in every jade mask laid upon a royal face. They are in every feathered serpent coiling across a temple wall. They are in every calendar cycle turning toward its completion. They are in the very idea that human beings can look at a swamp and see a city, can look at a block of volcanic basalt and see a king's face waiting to emerge, can look at the night sky and see a system of meaning that connects the movement of the stars to the rhythms of planting and harvest and prayer. The night is long, the jungle is dark, the rivers move slowly through the lowlands, carrying silt and seeds and the faint dissolved memory of everything that has ever lived along their banks. Somewhere beneath the mud, there are still monuments waiting to be found. Somewhere in the silence, there are still stories waiting to be told. The Olmec left their faces in the stone. They left their ideas in the blood of the cultures that came after them. The stone remembers, even when we forget. The ideas persist, even when the names are lost. And in the end, perhaps that is enough. Not to be remembered by name, not to be celebrated or mourned or studied in classrooms, but to have existed, to have built, to have created something beautiful and powerful in a place where nothing should have thrived. To have carved a face so strong and so calm that it endures for 3,000 years, staring out at a world that forgot everything about you except the one thing that matters most, that you were here, that you mattered, that the world you left behind is different and richer and stranger because of what you did. The Olmec were here. They were the first. They were the forgotten. And in their silence, they speak louder than any monument, any text, any name that history has ever preserved. They speak in jade and basalt. They speak in the echo of a rubber ball against a stone court. They speak in the turning of a calendar that has outlived the people who made it. And if you listen carefully, if you sit quietly with the knowledge of what they built and what they lost and what they gave the world without ever receiving credit, you can almost hear them. Not words, not names, just a presence, an old, deep, quiet presence, rising from the mud, enduring in the stone, flowing in the river of everything that came after. The forgotten ones are still here. They have always been here, and they will be here long after the last light goes out, and the last name is spoken, and the last story is told, because the stone remembers, and the river flows on. This has been the story of the Olmec, the mother civilization, the invisible foundation, the faces in the stone. Thank you for watching. And the next time you see a rubber ball bounce, or a calendar on a wall, or a serpent coiling through a piece of art, remember the people who started it all. Remember the ones who came from the swamp. Remember the forgotten.